The phone buzzed on my nightstand at 2:13 inches the morning. I remember the exact time because I'd been lying awake anyway, the way I always do on the anniversary of Claire's disappearance. 3 years. 3 years since my daughter walked out of her apartment in Vancouver and never came back. The police closed the active investigation 14 months ago. They used words like inconclusive and insufficient evidence and unlikely to be found. I used different words, mostly alone in my kitchen in Kelowna, mostly after midnight. I reached for the phone without thinking. The screen showed a number I didn't recognize. A Vancouver area code, 604. I answered. Dad. The voice was barely a whisper. Female. Young. Dad, don't open the door for anyone tonight. Please. Don't open it for anyone, no matter what they say. My chest stopped working. That voice, I hadn't heard it in 3 years. But a father doesn't forget. A father carries that voice in the walls of his chest like a second heartbeat. I sat up so fast I knocked my reading glasses off the nightstand. Claire? I said. Claire, is that... The line went dead. I sat in the dark for a long time, the phone trembling in my hand. Outside, the Okanagan night was perfectly still. No wind, the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something. My name is Walter Drummond. I'm 63 years old. I taught high school history for 31 years at Kelowna Secondary, retired 4 years ago, and I have spent the last 3 years becoming a person I don't entirely recognize. Quieter, harder around the edges. My wife Margaret passed from cancer 6 years back, and then Claire disappeared, and somewhere in the gap between those two losses, I stopped being the man who coached junior hockey on weekends and started being the man who checks the missing persons database every morning before coffee. Claire was 31 when she vanished. She worked in digital marketing at a firm in downtown Vancouver. She was sharp, funny, a little stubborn. She got that from me, Margaret always said. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown and very steady. The kind of eyes that made you feel like she was always thinking 3 moves ahead. She had no enemies. That was what I kept telling the police. She had no enemies, no debt, no history of mental illness, no reason to disappear. She went to work on a Tuesday in October, had lunch with a colleague named Diane, sent me a text at 4:47 p.m. that said, "Coming home for Thanksgiving? Already thinking about your stuffing, lol." And then she was gone. Her car was found at a Park Plus lot near Granville Street. Her phone was never recovered. Her bank account showed one withdrawal $400 from a machine in Gastown at 6:22 that evening. After that, nothing. I sat in the dark after that call for nearly an hour. Then I got up, made coffee, and started writing down everything I remembered about the voice. The way she said Dad, 2 syllables, almost. The breath before it, the urgency. The fact that she'd called me Dad instead of Walter, which is what she'd been calling me since she was about 16 because she thought it made me seem more human. I was not losing my mind. I know what you're thinking, because I thought it too. Grief plays tricks. A father who has lost a daughter will hear her in strangers' voices, in half-heard conversations across grocery store aisles. I know that. I spent 8 months seeing a grief counselor in Penticton after the investigation stalled. I am not the kind of man who mistakes wishful thinking for reality. That voice was Claire. I called the number back. It rang 11 times. No voicemail, no answer. I called again at 6 a.m. Same result. I called BC Telecom and was told, politely but firmly, that they couldn't release subscriber information to private individuals, only to law enforcement. I called Constable Reed at the RCMP detachment in Kelowna. Reed was the officer who'd originally handled Claire's file. He was decent enough, methodical, but I always sensed he'd moved on long before he officially closed the active case. I told him about the call. He told me he'd look into it and to sit tight. I didn't sit tight. I drove to Vancouver. It's a 4-hour drive from Kelowna through the Coquihalla, and I did it in 3.5. I have a cousin named Gerald who lives in Burnaby, and he let me use his spare room without asking too many questions. Gerald is the kind of man who understands that sometimes people need to move before they can think. I didn't know where to start. I started with Diane. Diane Kowalski had been Claire's closest friend at the marketing firm. I'd met her twice, once at a work Christmas party Claire had brought me to, and once at Margaret's funeral, where she stood near the back and cried quietly in the way that people do when they want to be respectful about not being family. She was kind. She'd sent me a card after Claire disappeared, and then another one on the 1-year mark, which struck me as the act of a person with genuine grace. I found her at the firm's new office on West Georgia. She looked startled to see me, then immediately sad in that way people get when they see you and can't help but calculate your losses before they say hello. We sat in a coffee shop around the corner. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've thought about calling you," she said. 100 times. "Tell me what you didn't tell the police," I said. She looked at the table. A long moment passed. "There was a man," she said finally. Claire had been seeing him for about 4 months before she disappeared. She never told me his full name. She called him R, just the letter. She said he'd asked her to keep it quiet for a while because things were complicated with his family. Diane looked up. "I know how that sounds." I knew how it sounded, too. "What else?" I said. She was scared of him near the end. She didn't say it directly. Claire never said anything directly. You know how she was, but I could tell. She canceled plans with me twice in the last 2 weeks. She seemed distracted. And then about a week before she disappeared, she sent me a message late at night. She said, "If anything ever happens to me, there's a storage unit in my name in New Westminster. The key is in the copy of Anne of Green Gables on my shelf." I set down my coffee. "Did you tell the police that?" I said. "Yes," Diane said. "They looked into the unit. Said it was empty. Said she must have cleared it out." She paused. "But I went there myself, about 2 weeks later. The unit wasn't empty. There was a box. It had been moved to a different unit, under a different name. I only found it because the manager felt sorry for me and bent the rules. Inside the box there were documents, printouts, financial records that I didn't understand, and a photograph of Claire with a man I'd never seen." Diane's voice dropped. "I took everything. I've had it in my house for almost 3 years, Walter. I didn't know what to do with it. The police had already told me the unit was empty and moved on, and I was afraid of who this man might be." We drove to her apartment in East Van. The box was in her closet behind a garment bag. It was a standard banker's box, the kind you get at Staples. Inside, there was a manila envelope of printed spreadsheets, a USB drive taped to the inside of the lid, and the photograph. I picked up the photograph. Claire was smiling. She was standing in front of what looked like a glass office building downtown somewhere, hard to tell which city. Beside her stood a man in his mid-40s, silver-haired, well-dressed. He had his arm around her shoulder in the way that people do when they want to look casual but aren't. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking slightly to the side, like someone who'd spent years being careful about where his face appeared. On the back, in Claire's handwriting, R. November 2020, in case. In case. My daughter had written a note, in case. She had hidden documents, in case. She had told her best friend about a storage unit, in case. She had been afraid, and she had been preparing, and she had not called me. She hadn't called me because she was protecting me. That is the kind of person Claire was. That is the kind of person her mother raised. I sat in Diane's living room for a long time. Diane made tea and didn't talk, which was exactly right. Eventually I asked her if she knew what was on the USB drive. She said she'd been too afraid to look. I plugged it into Diane's laptop. There were 47 files. Most were spreadsheets, dense, complex, full of numbered accounts and corporate names I didn't recognize. But there were also emails, printed to PDF and saved. Emails between a man whose address was listed only as a string of letters and numbers, and a series of addresses connected to what appeared to be shell companies. The language was careful, the kind of careful that takes practice, but the pattern was clear enough once you looked. Money moving in from one direction, being redistributed, reappearing under different names. The amounts were significant. Not hundreds of thousands, millions. I am a retired history teacher. I am not a forensic accountant. But I taught 31 years of history, and I know what it looks like when someone builds a system specifically designed to be difficult to trace. I know what it looks like when powerful people move money they don't want anyone to find. I took photos of everything with my phone. Then I sat back and thought about my daughter, alone in a Vancouver apartment, who had somehow stumbled into the middle of whatever this was, who had been careful enough to hide evidence, who had, on an October Tuesday, withdrawn $400 in cash from a machine in Gastown and then vanished. The call, "Don't open the door for anyone tonight." She was alive. I felt it with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with 31 years of being her father. She was alive and she was afraid and she had called me, which meant something had changed. Something had moved. Something had made it necessary to break 3 years of silence and risk a 2-second phone call in the middle of the night. I went back to my cousin's place and I didn't sleep. The next morning I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Osei, and she'd been recommended to me years ago by a colleague as someone who doesn't blink. She had a small practice in New Westminster and a reputation that ran ahead of her. I drove over and laid everything out on her desk. The photos, the emails, the spreadsheets, the photograph of Claire and R. Patricia did not blink. She spent 45 minutes going through everything without speaking. Then she looked up and said, "Do you know who this man is?" I said I didn't. She turned the laptop toward me and pointed at one of the email addresses. "This domain," she said. "I've seen it before. In a different context, a different file. It's connected to a property development company based in Richmond. They've been under quiet scrutiny for about 2 years. She paused. "The man in this photograph I'd need to confirm, but the description matches someone I know of. A businessman. Old family money, new money on top of it. Sits on 2 charitable boards. Very careful about his public image." "What does that mean for Claire?" I said. Patricia looked at me steadily. "It means your daughter may have found something she wasn't supposed to find. And it means the people she found it on have significant resources and significant reasons to make problems disappear." The word disappear sat between us like something physical. I drove back to Kelowna that evening. Gerald tried to feed me dinner before I left, and I couldn't eat. I sat in the car in his driveway for a few minutes before I could make myself start the engine. On the Coquihalla, somewhere above the Hope Slide, my phone rang again. Unknown number. 604. I answered immediately. "Dad." Her voice was stronger this time, more controlled. "Don't talk, just listen. I'm safe. I've been safe. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't." A pause. A breath. "There are people who've been watching the house. In Kelowna. Don't go home tonight, please." "Claire," I said. My voice came out completely wrong, too small. "Claire, where are you?" "I can't tell you that yet, but I'm working with someone who can help fix this. I need 2 more weeks. Can you trust me for 2 more weeks?" I said something that wasn't really a word. "Dad." Her voice broke on it, just slightly, the way it used to when she was small and had been trying hard not to cry. "I love you. I'll explain everything, I promise." The line cut. I pulled over at the Coldwater rest stop and sat with both hands on the steering wheel for a long time. A transport truck went past and the whole car shuddered. Then I called Patricia Osei and told her what had happened. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been making some calls of my own since you left. Walter, the man in that photograph, I believe his name is Raymond Cresswell. His son is a junior partner at a real estate law firm in Vancouver. His daughter sits on the board of a hospital foundation. He has been building a wall of respectability around himself for 20 years. And the money?" I said. "The money," Patricia said carefully, "appears to have come through a series of construction contracts in northern BC. Overinflated bids, ghost subcontractors, provincial infrastructure funding that was approved through a process that, to put it charitably, involved people who should not have been involved." A pause. "Your daughter worked in digital marketing, but she was also very good with data. Her firm had a contract with one of Cresswell's companies, a legitimate one, or meant to appear that way. I think she found something in the data she was working with and understood what it meant." I thought about Claire at 16, sitting at our kitchen table with a spreadsheet she'd built to track her summer job earnings, explaining compound interest to me with the patient condescension of someone who has just discovered that adults are not as competent as advertised. I stayed at a motel in Merritt that night. I did not go home. 14 days. I stayed with Gerald. I met with Patricia 3 more times. I gave copies of everything to a journalist. Patricia knew a woman named Susan at a paper I'll leave unnamed for now, who spent a week and a half verifying what we had. I gave a full statement to an RCMP Financial Crimes Unit officer in Vancouver, a serious woman named Sergeant Fontaine, who listened to everything I said without expression, and then said, "Mr. Drummond, we've been looking at some of these accounts for 8 months. What you've brought us fills in a significant gap. On the 15th day, at 7:42 the morning, someone knocked on Gerald's door. I opened it. She was thinner than I remembered. Her hair was shorter, dark circles under her eyes, wearing a raincoat that wasn't hers. She looked like someone who had been living carefully for 3 years, measuring every movement, every word, every moment. She looked exhausted in a way that went down to the bone. She also looked exactly like her mother. I don't remember moving. I just remember that we were standing in Gerald's doorway, and she was in my arms, and I had my face in her hair, and I was saying her name over and over like it was the only word I had left, which at that moment it was. We stood there for a long time. Gerald, to his credit, disappeared entirely. She had been in Montreal, a friend of a friend's apartment, someone with no connection to Vancouver or Kelowna or anything in Claire's old life. She had taken the cash withdrawal to buy a bus ticket east, paid for everything in cash for 3 years, worked remotely under a different name doing data work for a small firm that didn't ask many questions. She had been in contact with a retired RCMP officer she'd found through an advocacy group for people in witness-adjacent situations, a man named Douglas, who had been quietly helping her build a case from a distance, the same case we had been building from the other direction. She had called me on the anniversary of her disappearance every year, she told me. She had dialed and hung up before it connected. Every year, because she was afraid the number was being monitored. This year, something had changed. Douglas had confirmed that Cresswell's surveillance on the Kelowna address had been pulled back, that the operation was becoming unstable, that the moment had arrived. Raymond Cresswell was arrested on a Thursday in late November. His son was arrested the following Monday. The charges were extensive, and I will not detail them all here, but they included fraud over $5,000, significantly over breach of trust, and conspiracy. The story ran in 4 outlets. Patricia sent me a link to the CBC piece. I read it sitting at my own kitchen table in Kelowna, drinking coffee from my own coffee maker, which felt like an extraordinary luxury. Claire is in Kelowna now. She has a rental house 3 kilometers from mine. She is seeing a therapist, a good one, and so am I. We have dinner together on Sundays. She has started running again. She used to run half marathons before, and sometimes I drive out to the end of her route and meet her with coffee, the way I used to when she was training in university. She told me one of those Sunday evenings that the hardest part wasn't the hiding. The hardest part was Thanksgiving. Every year, in whatever apartment or room she was living in, she would think about stuffing. My stuffing. Specifically a recipe Margaret developed over 20 years, which I had spent the last 6 years trying to replicate with about 80% success. Claire said she would sit in Montreal in October and think about that stuffing and remind herself that it would still exist when this was over. I told her I would make it every Sunday until I got it right. I told her she had 30 or 40 more years to help me figure out what's missing. She laughed. It sounded like her mother. It sounded like the answer to something I'd been asking for a very long time. I am 63 years old, and I have learned some things the hard way about patience and about fear, and about what happens when powerful people decide that the rules do not apply to them. I have learned that paper trails exist even when people try to erase them, that small acts of preparation, a hidden key, a borrowed USB drive, a 2-second phone call at 2:13 the morning can hold an enormous amount of weight. I have learned that love is not a passive thing. It is not something that waits in a house in Kelowna and hopes. It gets in a car. It drives through the mountains. It sits in a lawyer's office in New Westminster and says, "Tell me what I need to know." And I have learned, or maybe I already knew this and just needed to remember, that the truth does not disappear simply because powerful people want it to. It waits, sometimes in a banker's box at the back of a closet, sometimes in the quiet work of a retired officer in a city you'll never know, sometimes in the voice of a daughter on the other end of a line, calling through 3 years of silence to say, "I love you. I'll explain everything." Don't wait to look for the truth about the people you love. Don't let anyone tell you that inconclusive means over. Don't let them make you comfortable with not knowing. I didn't. And she came home.